Okay. Let me go ahead and display this the way we should display it. And wait a minute. I can't tell it to share screen while it's doing that. Let's try that now. Okay. Do I have to set something here? Yeah, I do. Haven't done enough of this lately. Here we go.
Did you get them?
All right. Now let's see what we got. Can you see anything from me now?
Nope.
Let me try that.
Nope.
So Robert, what are you trying to share?
I'm trying to share a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, so either, yes, I mean, the straightforward, just when you press share, just either pick that PowerPoint or the desktop, and then you can choose any program.
Well, okay.
I mean, normally it works that way, but sometimes.
All right, let's do it this way. I got it. Okay.
All right, there we go.
Is that looking like something it's worth looking at?
Yep.
Good. Okay. I've in the past, I have taught history of psychology as well as experimental, and modern psychology, I don't think can pretend to be all that young anymore. By my reckoning, it's been around for about 160 years. I don't count from when somebody put a sign in front of a room and said, this is a psych lab. I go back a little farther than that. I don't know what percentage of the people listening in are psychologists, because a lot of the presenters here are from other fields, and given the nature of interactivism and what it has to say to different disciplines, that makes perfect sense. But unless Donald Campbell's fish scales get rearranged a whole bunch, there will still be a social science that will end up doing a lot of the empirical work to test interactivist or related hypotheses about language and cognition and social interaction and all that stuff. Psychologists have been collecting data for a while. I take the beginning of modern psychology when Wundt published a book in which he said, I'm going to start doing experimental psychology, because he did, okay? And 1915 is another interesting milestone, because that was the year in which Edouard Claparède, one of the mentors of Jean Piaget, admitted that it was no longer possible for him to keep up with all the new journal articles. He subscribed to all of the major journals then published in the field, and could read all of the major languages in which those journals were published. And in 1915, he had to give up and specialize, okay? So we've got psychologists amassing data, running studies, sometimes arguing over the results of studies for a very long time. But as Marcus pointed out before, and as we pointed out in our editorial in New Ideas in Psychology back in 2005, in many areas of psychology, data sets just keep accumulating. They don't even necessarily pile higher. They have not necessarily enabled anybody to stand higher or see farther. And there are some issues that we need to think about as to how we do empirical studies. I'm not going to focus mainly on which ones we decide are worth doing, because that's a matter for underlying theory and so forth. And we've been talking a lot about that, but it's obviously important. Underlying theory is also going to have something to say to us about which psychology studies from the past we think are worth replicating now, perhaps belatedly, and which ones we can just pass by and let somebody else worry about. Meanwhile, there are threats in the environment. I mean, I'm in the United States. The United States has clearly, I think, undergone a higher education bubble, as some economists call it. And some institutions are shrinking or closing as we speak. The effects of online education have in some ways been delayed in relation to the predictions, but I still think they're coming, and we don't know what the effects will be. We've also got, I'm going to be blunt about it, we've got trouble that psychology didn't used to have, even compared to some other social sciences, with ideologies such as critical race, gender, fill in the blank theory. It's starting to make inroads into what we do in psychology. When I began in the field, it didn't exist yet. When I started being a faculty member, it existed, but it was having no impact where I was. That's no longer true. Assuming, however, that we can conduct our empirical studies without ideological supervision and that we can afford to run them, I think a lot of replication studies are in order. Simply because of the manner in which psychologists conducted empirical research in the past. Too often we've been left with a lot that we thought we knew. In fact, so many people thought they knew it that it ended up in textbooks and so on. And we don't have any terribly good reason to think we really did know all of that. Some people here are actively working in areas where that's been a problem. I think of Jed's work in particular, but I'm sure many others are. Okay, so three kinds of hypotheses from a logical point of view. I'm going to make a logical case for replication being important, and then I'm going to make a statistical case. So this is the logical case first. If you've read, well, some middle Karl Popper and some late Karl Popper, you already know this stuff, okay? This is my personal take on it. Really, from a logical point of view, you have some hypotheses floating around in psychology that can't be tested empirically. They're metaphysical. Popper even bit the bullet eventually and called them such. That hasn't stopped psychologists from trying to test them empirically or claiming that they have delivered an empirical test to them, but they should know better. What can you test empirically? You can test universal hypotheses. Popper tended to write the most about those, but you can also test existential hypotheses. For some of you, this is going to be very familiar stuff, and it's probably also going to sound like it's been packaged for undergraduates, which for many years it was. All right, a universal hypothesis is about all members of a category. So if somebody claims, as I think a lot of memory researchers currently believe, that every normal adult human being has a working memory, and yeah, that word normal is not from formal logic, but in biology and the social sciences, we do have to use it. So let's not worry about it now, okay? Let's assume there are no particular measurement issues or special data collection issues. That is, there's a set of problems that we can give each participant. And by the time we're done, we're not only going to know whether this person has a working memory as that's normally understood, but roughly what its capacity is or something like that. All right. Okay, well, this may be true. I think most cognitive psychologists are inclined to believe it is at the present time, but the Popperian lesson is we can't verify it. We cannot collect a set of data that would be sufficient to prove that it's true. Simply restricting our focus to every normal adult human being alive today, we have given ourselves the job of collecting a data set that we're never going to be able to finish collecting. And by the way, one important Popperian point is how broad our generalizations actually are. This is not a generalization just about people who happen to be on the planet Earth in 2021. It's a claim about every member of our species who lived in the past and every member of our species who may be alive in the future. You're not going to be able to collect those sorts of data in most cases. Well, for future people, forget it. For past people, you're going to be pretty limited. Okay. Can't verify it, but if it's false, we can falsify it. In fact, all we need is one reliable counterexample. One case of somebody who is normal in the sense of appearing to have a normal brain architecture and some criteria like that, okay? But when given this set of working memory tests, just doesn't perform like a person with a working memory of any recognizable capacity would do, okay? All right, so those are universal. Existential, Popper was sometimes kind of dismissive about those, but we've got them in psychology. They're basically about human possibilities, so they're important too. Some human beings can correctly enumerate 100 plus objects very rapidly without counting. So the attendant spills the matches on the floor from a couple of matchboxes, and the Rain Man immediately says how many there are, okay? If anybody can do that, it's pretty easy to verify it. All you need is one reliable example. On the other hand, if you're inclined to doubt that anybody can do that, say your understanding of how human beings handle number and quantity does not encompass this kind of thing, you have to end up verifying that no human being can do this. And since your generalization is not actually limited to members of our species alive today, you'd also have to show that nobody could do it in the past and nobody will be able to do it in the future. So here you've got one that you might be able to verify if it's true, and you can't falsify it. Metaphysical hypotheses, I'll go lightly on because most students are not used to these at all, but we've been spending a lot of time talking about them, okay? So here are a couple of pretty common ones from psychology. For every operant behavior that a human being can add to his or her behavioral repertoire, there is a history of operant behavior and reinforcement. And then there's the fine print. It conforms to guidelines for schedules of reinforcement. I've always liked using that one because the last thing B.F. Skinner would have liked attached to any of his ideas was the word metaphysical, but there it is, okay? For every problem that a human being can solve, there is a computer program that solves the problem the same way, where the fine print says something about what the same way is supposed to mean. But the fine print doesn't tell you exactly what the computer program has to be or what it has to be like. Just as the pattern of operant behavior and reinforcement in the previous hypothesis has to be within certain guidelines or limits, but it doesn't have to be exactly 5 trials with electric shocks after every second trial or whatever, okay? Well, when you have a hypothesis like that, you end up in a situation where you have the vices of a universal hypothesis for every problem, actually also for every human being is buried in there. And you also have an existential hypothesis. So if you're trying to falsify the claim that there's a computer program that solves the problem the same way, how many different computer programs are you going to try? And if you've tried 300,000 and none of them did the job, a proponent of the hypothesis can say, sorry, you've been unlucky, you just need to try some more. And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. Okay. So I won't say too much more about metaphysical hypotheses or arguments against them, because that's something that is taken seriously in this company, not necessarily elsewhere. We're going to have to collect a lot of data that are relevant to universal and existential hypotheses. And in particular, when we're trying to make generalizations about human beings or some subcategory of human beings or some process commonly carried out by human beings or what have you, there's no finite set of results from empirical studies, no matter how carefully conducted, that will verify your universal hypothesis. All you can do, as Popper noted, is keep testing the same damn hypothesis. Maybe you got to vary your method a little bit from time to time. Keep trying to knock it down, see if it still stands up, okay? Maybe the 1021st replication that happens to produce results supporting the hypothesis, just like the last 1020 did, is less important, to pick up a theme that Mark mentioned. But in most areas of psychology, we're not in danger of running up more replications than we need, okay? Might happen a few places where something passes into the realm of laboratory demonstrations, but in many cases, it's not like that at all. Okay. Now, psychologists institutionally have a long history of disdain for replication. It's probably not news to anybody in the field, but until recently, most psychology journals that publish empirical work, which is what most of them do, weren't very interested in publishing replication studies at all. If there was some really hot controversy about something, maybe they do that for a short while. Otherwise, no. In fact, there have been many cases, and there still are. I'm going to mention a particularly notorious one in a while, where one article that makes a splash, that surprises people or appears to provide support for a hypothesis that hadn't been supported before and that people are invested in. One article that makes a splash with data in favor of a universal hypothesis has often had much more impact on the field than a long series of reports of well-conducted studies trying to falsify that hypothesis, even when some of them succeeded in doing it. Worse, until recently, and even now there are some technical issues we'd have to get into to really assess this further, but until recently, if you did a replication study and it reported no statistically significant results, that alone meant it wouldn't be published, okay? It would go into the proverbial file drawer. All right. So let's take an example of a study that not only made a splash, as far as I can tell, is still making a splash. It's not in what was ever considered my specialty in psychology, but I think I understand the situation well enough to be able to say that. Basically, nobody's tried to replicate it. And in fact, nobody probably should try to replicate it. The obvious reasons not to try to replicate this study are ethical reasons, but they're not the only reasons not to even bother replicating, okay? What on earth would that be? An experiment that's been influential and is not worth replicating. Many of you have probably heard of this experiment because it is widely and correctly singled out as an experiment that was conducted unethically. It violated the ethics of working with human subjects, pretty much as understood at the time and certainly as understood now. That ain't the half of it, as it turns out. I mean, I used to teach it as an example of violating the ethics of human subjects, but I didn't even know all the ways in which that had been done, okay? Stanford prison experiment. helped to make the career of Philip Zimbardo, helped to make the career of the main hypothesis, which was that in an environment like a prison, even a simulated one, if you assign somebody the role of guard and you assign somebody else the role of prisoner, the guards will start abusing the prisoners, okay? Many people believe that the hypothesis is true, and it may be, although Zimbardo's experiment should not be cited in its favor. Usually when we hear about the ethical problems, and the first publication by Zimbardo et al. In a psychology journal about the experiment was about its ethical problems. The original report of the experiment was in a journal about correctional institutions, okay? We hear that those assigned to be prisoners were frequently subjected to various levels of mistreatment by the guards, and some prisoners begged to be let out of the experiment early, and the whole thing was supposed to run for 2 weeks, and Zimbardo's team shut it down after 6 days, okay? That's all true, and these are ethical violations, but the prisoners, the people assigned to be prisoners, were not the only participants who suffered ethical violations, and the manner in which the results were reported violated the ethics of honest and clear data reporting, the ethics of scientific communication, in pretty much every way imaginable, and this has scarcely ever been looked at. All right. So, what would it mean to try to conduct a replication of it? Well, since the experiment raises the distinct possibility, if the hypothesis is correct, that the guards will abuse the prisoners, you probably shouldn't try it anyway. It would certainly be interesting trying to get informed consent for participation. This is true even though the advertisement recruiting participants for the Stanford prison experiment mentioned that it was a study of prison life. What you would expect people to take from such an advertisement, I do not know, but it was in there. Then there's all the stuff about data collection. You know, sometimes just the audio is running when the audio and video were supposed to be running. You know, important stuff apparently happened that didn't get captured in either of those media. And there were a couple of issues about the relationship between the research team and the guards. The people who were chosen to be guards complained afterwards that they had been led to believe that data were not being collected on them, that they were effectively part of the research team. Of course, the report of the study was frequently about what the guards did, particularly when it was abusive. If that's not bad enough, there's also the fact that members of the research team, basically people who were on watch during various phases of the experiment, because, you know, it ran 24/7 for 6 days, basically. People would get called into the office of one of Zimbardo's people and told that they were being too nice to the prisoners and they should stop doing that. Okay. In other words, Zimbardo's own team would call guards in if, in their opinion, they were not being sufficiently abusive. All right. Okay. Well, what were the downstream effects of this? Harm to the reputation of the lead investigator. It's reasonably clear that Zimbardo was more famous after running the experiment than he'd been before running it. He certainly did not lose his standing in his specialty. His textbook on social psychology has had at least, I don't know, 13 editions, okay? Did it bring discredit on the hypothesis that if you create such an environment and you assign people to the role of guard, they will, without needing to be instructed, start abusing the prisoners? No, a lot of people still believe that's true. Zimbardo still maintains his experiment shows it's true. Now, if you want to know more about this, you need to read French. This is a book that came out a few years ago by Thibault Le Texier, who was a French social scientist who is, I would call, a social critic of certain practices in the social sciences. His other book is an examination of theories of management and is meant to be critical of them and of management research. As of today, I looked on Amazon shortly before my presentation. There is no English translation of this book. I'm kind of wondering whether there will be one or not. If you can handle the French, it's very thorough. The guy went through all of the surviving videotapes, all kinds of surviving paper records and correspondence, tons of stuff that was never published in any form by the research team. He even goes into the background of Zimbardo himself and of the department and what its culture might have been like and all that kind of thing. Okay. Now, as we continue looking at the ethics of scientific communication, all right, that's going to bring us to my second case for why we got to do a lot of replication studies. Has to do with data presentation that does not rise or sink to the level set by Zimbardo et al. Obviously, nobody should be doing that, but in more recent years, we have seen some revelations about psychologists either altering values in the spreadsheets for data sets so that certain hypotheses would turn up the quote right way unquote, or publishing studies that where no data were ever collected. Okay. The exhibit A for that is a former Dutch social psychologist named Diederik Stapel. He was caught faking data and altering data in 2011, okay? And I'm not stressing exactly what he did because the kinds of issues that are most often discussed with regard to data reporting now have to do with improper use of statistics. They're not as serious as what Stapel did. It's nonetheless worth noting that Stapel had been altering data for at least 15 years when they caught him, faking data for at least 10, studies containing altered or completely fake data had been published by all kinds of journals worldwide, large and small. Okay, so high prestige had nothing to do with filtering out this stuff. It was also nearly impossible to get anybody to investigate what he had been doing. It took a delegation of his graduate students who found that he was altering their own data, visiting the president of their university. And even then, there was no guarantee that that was going to work. Fortunately, that person listened. An investigation was commissioned. There's something called the Leffelt report after the most senior guy on the committee. It's very thorough. It's worth reading. It was published in English as soon as it was published in Dutch, and you can get it online. On the other hand, after being exposed, Stapel published a memoir in Dutch, whose title literally means something like derailment or going off the tracks. That will not be published in translation, at least not while he's alive, okay? Now, there was something that the authors of the Leffelt report got into in the final chapter, was basically, okay, this is not what the guy we're investigating got into trouble for. It's not as bad as that, but we do notice that a lot of people are doing this and they really shouldn't do it, okay? It was a chapter about what are now called questionable research practices, okay? Typical examples, you designed your study and you collected the data and you started analyzing it. on the assumption that your study was to test a certain hypothesis. After you see the data, you do some analysis. The patterns are not favorable to your original hypothesis, but hey, they look favorable to a different one. So you report your study as though that different hypothesis was what you had in mind all the time, okay? You know, you're not doing things a priori with your hypotheses. Another one is collecting various data on various dependent variables. You know, imagine giving people a bunch of surveys about different issues. And if certain items on the surveys don't behave the way that you wanted them to or expected them to, you just leave them out and never mention that they were collected. You don't even say, hey, we also tried this and didn't work very well, so that's all we're going to say about it. You just don't mention it. Another thing you can do in the age of computers, well, the computers we have now, when I was in grad school, rerunning a statistical analysis meant preparing a new deck of IBM 80-column punch cards with new cards with instructions on the front, going to the computer center, submitting the thing, hoping they would run it pretty fast and hoping that when I saw the output, it wouldn't be messed up. Okay, not anymore. You can check on your statistical analyses as often as you want. You could be intending to include 200 people in your study, and when you get to 10, you can see what it looks like, and when you get to 55, and whenever you like, okay? Now, what some people have ended up doing, since they can rerun these analyses whenever they like, is called optional stopping. We're going to collect and input data into our data set, and we're going to keep running these interim analyses. And as soon as that key inferential statistic, that t-test is supposed to go this way, that analysis of variance is supposed to look like that, this correlation that's supposed to be really strong, whatever it is, comes out significant or comes out the way you want it to. So even if you were planning to collect data on 200 people, if you get the results you want after running data, 98 participants, that's what you do. You stop and you treat your study as though it was never meant to include more than 98 participants. Okay. Now, first of all, these are all things that are good to avoid. And if you want to know exactly why they're good to avoid, there are some good analytical articles that show what distortions can result from doing optional stopping and all that kind of thing. But traditional peer review practices in psychology, and I've been on both ends of those for quite a few years, do not normally involve looking at somebody's raw data. I mean, some journals are now requiring that the raw data be provided, but that's a very recent thing. They don't typically involve reanalyzing the raw data in case the way the authors did it was not the best way to do it or whatever, okay? The other thing was that the final chapter of the Leffelt report was the only one that drew complaints from other psychologists. You know, they read the first few chapters and said, God, that's awful, we'd never do that. But a bunch of social psychologists got to the last chapter and said, why are you saying that's a questionable research practice? Why are you saying we shouldn't do this? We've all been doing this for years. It's perfectly okay. Okay. In other words, what were listed as questionable research practices were defended by established researchers in the field. All right. Well, since then, there have been some efforts, some of them I think better guided than others, to combat questionable research practices. There's even the idea of putting a research plan in a public registry that would declare your exact hypotheses before you collect any data. I'm not sure that's always the best idea. but we can talk about that later if you want. There's also a push for putting complete data sets, anonymized if they had stuff that would otherwise identify the people who took part, in publicly accessible repositories. I think that's a really good idea, and the more of that, the better. It doesn't mean that everyone who is a little suspicious of some research report is going to take the time and trouble to go through the raw data, but if people have access to it, at least they can do it. Now, even if various reforms to try to discourage corpse, questionable research practices, are successful, the best that will do is result in more studies being published that will lend themselves to being replicated, that are in fact they'll be more likely to have results that other people will find when they do a comparable study. Letting people look at raw data and even reanalyze the data will also have that effect. But other people, preferably people coming from different places with different assumptions and biases and theories and ideas about how best to design a study, still have to run all the replications. The journals have to publish them, and the rest of the field has to pay attention to them, okay? These are all needful, and I'm not presently convinced that all those conditions will be met. Now.
Yeah, Robert.
Yep, excuse me. Mm-hmm.
Sorry to
Yep.
interrupt. In about 5 minutes, it'll be 45 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
Keep that in mind.
I think I'm in a reasonable spot.
Good.
Okay, there's one further wrinkle, and that is that something like optional stopping involves the abuse of inferential statistics. You're basically substituting an ad hoc conditional distribution for the distribution that your test statistic is supposed to have, okay? And it would be good to get people to stop doing that. But there's an underlying problem that we scarcely ever talk about in psychology. And that's how often the test statistics are going to have the distribution they're supposed to have anyway, okay? In mathematical statistics, what kind of sampling is always assumed? I mean, always. I don't know of any exceptions. Got to be a random sample. What kind of sampling is basically not used in psychology? Random sampling from the population to which you wish to generalize. Psychology is full of very broad generalizations about human beings or large subgroups of human beings or things that nearly all human beings do or whatever, okay? So you got random sampling, which is what the mathematicians understand, and in terms of which various inferential statistics have been developed. And you've got the samples that psychologists actually recruit and use. What do we call the samples that psychologists normally use? It does get taught to students nowadays.
Freshmen, undergraduates.
Well, that's pretty close. Okay. There's an old remark that psychology, this was around 1940, is the study of the white rat and the college sophomore. Okay. Scratch out the white rat, you know, much harder to work with white rats now, need the same medical care as monkeys. College sophomores, yep, still is. So the standard term for the kind of sample that we actually get is a convenience sample. Now that jams two nouns together and Michael Billig says don't do it, but we'll call it that, all right? You recruit people who are readily available, students, maybe other staff people, maybe people who live nearby, not connected with your institution. unless no one from the population of interest really dwells in your vicinity, you're probably not going to go anywhere else. So the old saying is still at least half true. Now, I point out in some further slides that I won't try to get into here in the interest of time, why trying to get a random sample from any of the large populations, like say all normal adult human beings that psychologists want to generalize to, is something that nobody tries to do. And that's because they know pretty much what they would have to do in order to get it. And they know that that's not feasible. Not economically feasible. Also not feasible because most studies ethically require informed consent. And if you're able to select somebody at random and communicate with them and ask for their informed consent and they say, I don't want to do that, then you have to replace them with somebody. Okay, even if you randomly select the replacements, are there any interesting differences between the people who accepted your offer to be in your experiment and the people who didn't? There probably are. Do you know what these differences are? You don't. Okay. All right. So we have a big problem in psychology that is just barely acknowledged. I mean, psychologists will say, yeah, when it comes right down to it, I've got a convenient sample and you've got one. And practically everybody who publishes stuff in psychology journals is using them, but they don't talk about the implications. None of our statistical procedures were developed for use with convenient samples, okay? We're in totally unknown territory there. I think, and this is simply my guess based on being in the field for a while and talking to people and trying to make sense of what they do, that psychologists normally act as though a convenient sample is okay, because somehow everybody in the population, even a very large population that people are trying to generalize to, is obviously not the same as the people in the sample of Clemson sophomores or 30-year-olds from New Zealand or whatever in a lot of other respects. But with regard to the attributes being studied, you know, memory capacity, let's say, they are pretty much the same. Now, first of all, we don't know whether that's true going in, obviously. Second of all, if that is true, we would be able to generalize from convenience samples to great big populations, and we wouldn't even need inferential statistics. Okay? And we don't know when our assumptions are correct. So suppose somebody in the last year collected data on New Zealand college students who caught a certain respiratory virus, and they assumed that their results would generalize to preschoolers or middle-aged people or old people. Well, if it's the virus that caused the pandemic last year, we know now that those results definitely will not generalize to these other age groups, not even close. Okay, so there's also a statistical case for replication. Even if everybody quits quirping tomorrow, no more questionable research practices, no more optional stopping, any of that stuff, we're still making use of statistics in psychology for purposes that they, as far as we know, can't really be used for. And again, just as with Popper's logical argument, we have no realistic option with a lot of the empirical work we do, but to try a lot of replications and see what happens. Okay, now I will leave out, in the interest of time, a few slides I tacked on at the end. If you were at an Interactivist event in 2015, you might have seen these. They're the only ones I've used before. It's such a thing. They have to do with improving communication by writing better. And they include key opinions from Michael Billig, a discourse analyst in Britain, who believes that psychologists not only write badly, but they're taught to do it on purpose. And from Steven Pinker, who is trying to cut his colleagues a break, but nonetheless admits that a lot of psychologists write badly and need to learn how to write better. I'll just leave those, you know, if anybody wants to discuss them, that's fine. Okay. So let me take this off the screen if I can figure out how to do that. There we go.
Alrighty, any questions or
Well,
comments?
I'm sure there will be some. All right, who's first? Mark,
Mr. Mark.
then Jed, then Onur, if I'm pronouncing a name correctly. Okay. Got to be able to hear you, Mark. Mark, you're muted.
Forgot to unmute.
There we go.
Basically, I agree with most everything here. I just want to add a few points to elaborate.
Yeah, by the way, I am not a trained statistician, and Mark is, so keep that in mind.
First of all, one of your later points, I think, is exactly correct, that part of the assumption or background assumption to convenient sampling is the assumption of homogeneity.
Right.
We don't need a random sample of, or at least we think we don't need a random sample of instances of copper in order to test malleability and conductivity and so on of copper, because we assume that there's a fundamental homogeneity there. Maybe with copper we're right, although, you know, sometimes we make that kind of an assumption and then discover we were wrong, that there is a relevant heterogeneity.
Yeah, but look at the historical development of theories in physics and chemistry that has led us to be pretty confident that each sample of copper will be very much like each other one.
Well, yes, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
It isn't as if we don't have any evidence for that.
Yeah.
Some statisticians, even people who write famous statistics books, know some of this stuff, but they can't get it across. I wrote a paper called Myths of Science in which I talked about some of these. And Bill Hayes, who back then was a major statistician with a major statistics textbook, and Don Campbell read it and really liked it. But I had a hell of a time trying to get it published because people had misconceptions about the way statistics works and the way research works. And
I was Bill Hayes' teaching assistant once upon a time.
Yeah.
So I've got to say it was the course in which I felt least adequate as a teaching assistant, but it was a good experience.
Yeah, so that ends up, well, and also people like Don Campbell wrote a book on quasi-experimentation that does not require, although the statistics is still difficult to satisfy the underlying assumptions, does not require random assignment to conditions.
Right.
And as you say, if in fact the underlying universe from which you're sampling is in fact homogeneous, you don't really need inferential statistics. I mean, you only need inferential statistics if there's some random something or other that is, quote, noise, unquote, relative to what you're trying to test.
Right.
The one additional emphasis I would make is that you didn't mention control conditions.
No, I specifically wanted to generalize across empirical studies and not just look at experiments, because experiments raise their own issues, and you and Jed have done that. Also, I used to preface every semester of experimental psych by saying we call it this out of tradition, because once upon a time it was taught as though everything you were going to do in it would be an experiment, but that's not most of what you're going to do, and it's not most of what other psychologists do, and sometimes it's not even what other psychologists can do. We're going to learn about correlational stuff and about surveys and so on. Yeah.
The last point is that I agree with this compendium of bad practices. And I would simply offer a couple of thoughts about the sources of some of them, because I think they don't all have the same source. I mean, the source of
Uh-huh.
some of them is obviously just ethical.
Hmm.
People faking data and so on. Another realm is competence. People don't understand the statistics well enough to know that they're violating assumptions about the underlying probability distributions and so on. Incidentally, there are, again, some statisticians who try to explore that because they try to explore how, quote, robust, unquote, a statistical test is relative to various kinds of violations of the underlying assumptions. And sometimes they're sort of robust, and sometimes they're not robust at all. But people using these statistics generally don't know anything about that. And then last, I would explain or claim to explain some other sources just in terms of philosophy of science, of a philosophy of science of inductivism. And this again is something that Hayes, Don Campbell, all statisticians know. Statistics is not inductive. Statistics is decision-making among some set of alternatives. And if you just assume that it's inductive, then some of these practices seem to make sense. I mean, you are accumulating data that seem to be in favor, even if you're stopping your data collection when it looks like you've got a, quote, statistically significant result, and so why collect anymore? So I think the underlying philosophy of science is also at fault in some strong respects here.
Well, that's why I was in the habit of first introducing hypothesis testing as a logical issue and saying, yeah, there are other things we'll have to deal with, but we'll get to them later. Then I would talk about issues pertaining to measurement in psychology, which I didn't even touch on here, but myths of science certainly does. You know, why operational definitions are a terrible idea and you can't think about it that way and so on. And then I would get to the statistical aspect of it, because you need the logical analysis to show why inductivism is wrong. And then you need the statistical analysis to show that other stuff is happening as well at the statistical level.
Yeah, once upon a time, I taught a 3-course sequence in which the first course was philosophy of science. The second course I called epistemological methodology, and the third course was linear models and statistics. And they all built on each other. But most people they don't even get taught linear models, let alone all 3.
But we've had to fight a number of times in the past at Clemson just to keep the required course in experimental psychology, where the students do their own projects and analyze their own data.
Yeah.
So that's the best we could do. Okay. Let's see.
Right. It was
Jed. Okay.
Onur was second.
Onur and
Onur?
then Jed. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Georgi, if we can do it. Yeah.
I just have a brief question about the more recent trends in sampling for researchers, which is basically the use of online platforms such as the Mechanical Turk. Would you like carry your criticism directly to there, or would you treat Mechanical Turk in a somewhat different way?
All right. I don't have a lot of personal experience with that. However, until I retired, I was working close to people who were doing applied psychology. I mean, they were grad students doing stuff on organizational psychology and so on. And I heard stories about things like Mechanical Turk, and some users of it were pretty happy with the results they got, and others were not. I personally would be very cautious about it, even if you're not compensating people because they don't have to do a lot of lengthy, tedious procedures. You know, you're just throwing something up on the web and maybe having some other people link to it, and you expect the inherent interest of the content, you know, say it's about moral values or something, to carry the day. I mean, if you want a highly unrepresentative sample, to use a word I specifically bypassed in my presentation, I do have a couple of slides about what that would mean. If you want a really unrepresentative sample of human beings around today, that's a good way to get it. There are all kinds of people who don't have the access or don't have the bandwidth or whatever that you can't reach. So yeah, I think these online services where, you know, people are paid to be sort of professional participants, okay for some things, not at all for others.
All right, so we have only, technically we have only 2 minutes left. So I'm gonna give the last comment to Jorge, unless our next speaker, who is, sorry,
Alex.
Alex, yeah. How could I forget?
Jorge, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, Jed was first.
Well,
Yeah.
We also
okay,
started.
yeah, do you want to go?
Yeah, all right,
My questions are straightforward. We also started 3 minutes late, so you may want to add that.
all right.
Okay.
Do you mind if we cut in just a little bit? We can go longer.
Stoppage time, okay.
Okay.
My questions would be done by now if I just get them out this way.
All right.
So first question is, I wrote it down. First question is, can restricting the scope of our generalization solve the convenience sampling? I.e., you know, I don't say people, I say Southeastern American college kids. And then my second question,
Okay.
but it's also a bit of a comment. So the first one's restricting scope of the generalization. The second one is, did you leave registered reports out for a reason? And relatedly, have you thought about how universities play a role in all of this? Because of course, I just read today, a Dutch university has stopped using impact factors for tenure decisions, which is, you know, lovely, but universities are as sort of culpable in this whole incentive to publish garbage
Okay.
as the journals, as the reviewers, etc.
Okay. University administrations, I will say only the following, okay? And by the way, from comparing war stories with colleagues, including some in other disciplines besides, oops, sorry about that, psychology, I think Clemson actually wasn't too bad, okay? In some ways, it was well above the norm for administrative behavior. Virtually any idea that administrators get about assessing the performance of research faculty is a non-starter, okay? I would just start there. I wrote a critique of a lot of this stuff in the year 2000. It was submitted to be published in a book that was coming out from the Hoover Institution. I got a call from the editor saying, you know, I'm really sorry, I like your chapter, but the Hoover Institution has a bad enough relationship with the central administration at Stanford already. And if we publish your chapter, it will be irreparable. Okay, so it didn't happen. But a lot of other people have noted the same things now in public. I don't think I need to weigh in further. Okay, what were your other two questions real quick?
Registered reports, but just skip it, it's fine. And the other one I'm more interested in.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes. I am concerned about always requiring that hypotheses and maybe some details of design be published in advance. I don't think that's necessary. Okay, third.
Restricted scope for the generalization.
Restricted scope. I actually have some slides in there, which I can make available. I'll make the whole set available afterwards, that talk about the difference between a really large sample, a really large population and a sample from a smaller population. The examples I used to give students were like registered voters in South Carolina. Okay, within the limits of official records and their accuracy, you know, if you really want to know what the population is in a given year, you can find out. And then you can try to draw a random sample, although you won't end up being able to do it for the reasons I explained. But it has to be a population that's pretty tightly defined and that you know a lot about. College students in the Southeastern United States is still too big a population from my point of view. You'd have to narrow it down quite a bit further, which sometimes you can do. And in some of the other social sciences, people have more opportunities to do it as well.
All right, real quick, since we heard from Georgi earlier, Jorge?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering about butterfly effect, which is relevant for nonlinear dynamics, like maybe the cognitive dynamics in a classroom. So maybe we have to rethink a bit what you mean by replicability. That's my question.
Well, okay. I didn't even try to get into any issues posed by nonlinearity, although I think they are quite important to psychology. One of the reasons why Friedrich Hayek thought that empirical research in psychology was never going to get anywhere was because it was looking for linear relationships all the time. I think he had a point. I left that out simply because of the greater complexity that would be added, because the kind of statistical procedures we should be using if we seriously expect nonlinear effects, as we ought to, you know, I don't even know if they're all available. I don't even know if those tools all exist. At a conference a few years ago, I showed a graph from a study that one of my students had done about relating self-reported self-esteem and narcissism. It was well fit by a quartic equation. I just put that up there and let them think about it for a while, because I don't know what to do about all of that. And I don't know that many people in the field do, but that could be the best fit there.
All right. So we have like 1 more minute. Georgi, was your question quick or?
Sure, it's quick, but I put them in the chat anyways.
Oh, I see.
Just 2 comments. I mean, I think Robert talked specifically about psychology, but I would generalize this, and it's by chance that yesterday I had a heated discussion with a colleague about this exactly, because my claim was that there are virtually no incentives to do an application study in any field. So that can be generalized all over the
well, in fact, the anxiety about quirps started in medical research. And if you look at the history of people being caught faking data, altering data, articles being retracted because of really gross stuff being done and so on, medicine's a higher stakes field in a lot of ways than psychology. And so the public revelations started there first. So yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of this stuff is affecting other fields. I just, haven't done a survey.
And there is no incentive for you to do it, obviously, unless you're curious for yourself to see. And the second comment was that regarding the mechanical Turk, even if you do not pay the participants, the sample is skewed because they're self-selected because of something. Over that something, you don't have any control, obviously. So
right.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, Alex, do you mind if we take just a few more minutes for comments or?
Okay.
Or you're muted. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Another couple minutes is fine, but I am gonna have to.
Yeah. We're not no longer than that.
Okay.
All right, Mark.
Okay. I just had some anecdotes. I'll just mention one. Around 1970, I was involved with the National Opinion Research Center at Chicago, who was doing a whole series of surveys. And they attempted to do a full probability sample of the United States. Now, obviously, nothing's going to be completely successful in that. But I wanted to just illustrate one part of it to show how impossible this really is. They had to derive what's called a sampling frame. Well, what's a frame? You don't just go out and randomly sample among individuals. You don't even have a list of individuals anywhere. You have to do some sort of a stratified representative sampling of households or blocks of households or something like that. And then you go out and send people to do the actual survey, which of course is enormously complicated and highly expensive. But the point I wanted to focus on is just drawing the sampling frame about 1970 cost $100,000 in 1970 dollars. I have no idea what that is today, but believe me, it was enormously expensive, and I'm sure it would be today. So there was an attempt to take seriously some of these sampling issues. And when you stop and think about it and look at some of those costs, it makes it clear that that's not going to be the standard procedure.
Yeah, when I was going to positive psychology meetings, when the Gallup organization was big on sponsoring them, I heard a presentation about how Gallup had done the sampling for an attempted worldwide opinion survey. And I don't want to know how much that cost, okay? It was still highly incomplete, and they were very frank about the limitations of it. Hey, if somebody doesn't want to introduce you around a certain village, you're not going to get anything. But the costs were enormous. Okay, Muga, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, thank you. So real quick, I just want to point out that replications by themselves would not really contribute to the rhetoric without an overarching theory, because we see that even if the original studies are not replicated, or even they are falsified, there is a lot of rhetoric. Oh, it is not an exact replication, there was some variable, etc. And it doesn't contribute to the progress of the field as a whole. But now the subject of this conference is an overarching theory of psychology. And I wonder why in all these studies, there is this isolated hypothesis testing without such theories as Marx.
Okay, very quickly, because you've raised a bunch of big issues there, I think. First of all, it does matter how you explain the results, okay? One reason why we don't have to worry so much about people acting as though this sample of copper is very much like that other one is because all of the work that has been done building and testing the theories that underlie that assumption. We don't have nearly as much of any of that kind of stuff regarding human beings and what human beings do. So any assessment, any attempted assimilation of a series of studies, including replications, is going to involve theoretical argument. There's no way around it. I tell students that in experimental psych, or I did, although I also tell them, hey, we're trying to teach you how to use empirical techniques, so we can't really get further into that now. But yeah, sure.